Hi, I'm Andrew Connell. I'm an MVP with Office Servers and Services. And in this module, we're going to talk about building universal Windows platform native applications with the Microsoft Graph. Specifically, we're going to talk about getting into the Microsoft Graph API, getting started, an overview of universal Windows platform applications, and then creating a universal Windows platform application for the Microsoft Graph using Azure AD for authentication. Microsoft's Office 365 developer vision focuses on the user's experience and their data. As a developer, you can bring your applications into their user experience. So with over 1.2 billion users of Office worldwide, this is a huge opportunity to provide a window into your different applications, as well as being able to connect into their data and add intelligence to your applications. There are currently 850 million events created a month and a total of 470 petabytes and more of data stored in the service that can add value to and for our users of your applications. So what does it look like to build an application that's going to be integrated with Office 365? Well, as you can see at the very bottom here, we've got access to a lot of different data sources inside of Office 365. And the best way to get to them is using the Microsoft Graph API. That Microsoft Graph API is going to essentially act as a proxy to all of these different services that are available to us. Now, in order to call the Microsoft Graph, we're going to have to first authenticate. And we're going to do that using Azure AD. And that's going to allow us to authenticate either using our consumer accounts, like a Microsoft account, or using our work and school account, or like an Azure AD-based identity that we would use in Office 365. You also are going to be able to leverage the OpenID Connect, which is going to give us the ability to get some information about the currently logged on user. Now, once we are authenticated, we then have the option of many different ways that we can talk to the Microsoft Graph. And the way we're going to do that is using different environments. Now, in the case of this scenario, we're going to be looking at using Android Studio and working with a strong API SDK for the Microsoft Graph. And then we can build our application using anything else that we want to end up using here. So in this case here, we're going to build one that's going to show events from a calendar in Office 365. Now let's talk a little bit about authentication and how this works with the Microsoft Graph. The Microsoft Graph leverages Azure Active Directory, or Azure AD, like so many other cloud services from Microsoft. And this is going to provide authentication and authorization capabilities for our applications. You can create web apps as well as native apps with Azure AD apps. And in addition, users can authorize the application using the delegated consent, where they grant the application to act on their behalf. Global tenant admins can also grant consent to all users as a different type of consent. We call that the admin consent. Azure AD application authentication is implemented using the OAuth 2 protocol. So users are redirected to Azure for authentication credentials so that the custom applications never get the actual credentials of the user. We just redirect them over to Azure, and then Azure is going to give us back some information, or give the user some information that they will provide the application to log in. Depending on the authentication flow that we leverage, the app is ultimately going to get an access token that's only valid for a specific amount of time for a specific user with specific permissions and for a specific resource. In our case here, that's the Microsoft Graph. These access tokens can be refreshed after they expire using an associated refresh token. And the login process also supports multi-factor authentication and federated authentication that Microsoft's Azure AD supports. Now, native applications differ from web applications in a few different ways because first, they're multi-tenant by default, and you don't need to worry about sending app credentials or app secrets when the native app is distributed, because it can't contain a secret, because once you distribute the app, it's never really going to be a secret. So instead, we're going to use some special redirection URLs. Now, all Office 365 cloud services, including SharePoint Online and the Microsoft Graph, leverage Azure AD for authentication and authorization. And this means there is a single authentication flow that we're going to use for Office 365 applications, as well as those that are created to leverage the Microsoft Graph. Now let's talk about the Universal Windows Platform. Platform convergence has been a journey which ends with Windows 10. Microsoft started by using the same Internet Explorer code and engine on the Windows Phone 7.5 and Xbox 360, and they started implementing the Microsoft Modern Design language in those places. With the release of Windows 8, they converged on the Windows kernel, which aligns among other things, the hardware extraction layer and other driver models. Windows Phone 8 took advantage of the new lighter weight kernel to enable multiple CPUs and other improvements, and the Xbox One was built on top of Windows 8. Xbox also introduced XJS, which is a version inside of Xbox of WinJS, so developers could write apps in HTML and WinJS with the same framework that was available on Windows 8. With the release of Windows Phone 8.1, the runtimes from Windows 8.1 and Windows Phone came together as well, continuing up the Windows stack and building upon the kernel convergence that happened in 8.0. Aligning the app models and the API set, bringing about 90% or more API convergence and unification and convergence of things like Windows notification services, backstack behavior, sharing contacts, live tiles, etc. And finally, with Windows 10, Microsoft brings a complete unification of the Windows families that now provides a Windows core that can be used on embedded and IoT devices. To bring the family together, Windows 10 is built upon a unified core, the Windows Core, and a unified app platform, the Universal Windows Platform. Meaning that all of the devices families that run Windows are really going to be the same at their core. This provides the consistency that users need and the tailored experiences that they desire. Now, gone are the days of Microsoft maintaining a number of code bases that work to build bridges across silos. Windows has evolved to do that all on its own. And gone are the days of ISVs doing that as well. Targeting Windows provides a single roadmap to the billion-plus Windows screens that are out there. Now, enabling this consistent yet tailored Windows experience are a number of different services. There's an adaptive user experience, which is a user interface design that adapts and reflects to the device family that it's running on. Natural user inputs like speech, natural link, gesture, and facial recognition. Cloud-based intelligent services like Cortana AI, Personal Hubs, OneDrive, Office 365, Windows notification services, and a credential locker. And the Windows Store, which is universally available apps and games and digital media. For the app builder, this also means that you can build one Windows solution that runs across all the Windows device families and use these Windows services to tailor your experience at runtime. The other thing that's nice about the UWP platform is that everything is going to be tuned to each form factor, from Windows PCs to Windows phones to Windows on Xbox and Windows for other things as well, like form factor appropriate shell experiences or device specific scenario support. They're all based on one core operating system, one base OS, one app and device platform, and one runtime and framework. We talked a little bit about the adaptive user experience here, which is the same code and same controls that are going to give us the optimized layout based on the application and the device that we're currently working on. These tailored experiences are going to be based on a set of adaptive controls and enable an experience that's been tailored specifically to the device that you're currently on. It also means there's only one binary for every device that you're working for. So there's no more shared project for specific platform projects that you need to deal with. There's no more conditional code that you've got to write. There's only one store. And this UWP is available on every Windows 10 based device. So the UWP is a collection of contacts and extensions. So when you create an app, you target a version of UWP. You don't target the operating system per se. So here we have a minimum and a max version that our application is targeted towards, or that has been tested against. Now for the platform extensions, there are SDKs to add specific platform APIs that are on top of the Windows platform here. So we have things like for mobile, or we have things for desktop, for different things that we want to also add extensions to for those different experiences that are unique to those different platforms and services. So let's look at the story about what is involved in creating a UWP application. Well, it's a lot like you do when you create any other kind of a native application. You're going to first create the application, and in this case, we're going to use Visual Studio. And then we're going to implement the user experience. And I like to do this because it gives me a flow of how the application is going to work and what the user experience is going to look like without any data in it, without any authentication. We could just essentially have a click through. I'm then going to go extend the application to support authentication with Azure AD and to acquire a token from Azure AD. And in my case, we're going to use that to leverage calls to the Microsoft Graph .NET SDK. So we're going to use Visual Studio to first create the application, as you see here in the File New Project Experience. I'm then going to implement the user experience and test it and make sure everything works. In this demo, we're going to create a universal Windows platform application using the Azure AD v2 authentication endpoint and the Microsoft authentication library to access data in Office 365 using the Microsoft Graph. So in this specific demo, we're going to create a brand new application. So I'm going to go File, New Project, and I'm going to pick the blank app as my option here. And then I'm just going to put this inside my dev folder, inside the root here, and we'll just leave it called Native O365 Calendar Events. And I'll go ahead and click Next. Now, when prompted here for the minimum versions and target versions, I'm going to leave this as default, but you can change this to target a specific version of Windows 10 if you like. So I'm going to now just let Visual Studio go ahead and create the project. Okay, with the project created, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go add some necessary NuGet packages to the project that I know we're going to need. So I'm going to open up References and click on Manage NuGet Packages. And I'm going to first look for, in the Browse tab, I'm first going to look for the Microsoft Graph. And so I'll find the Microsoft Graph and I'm going to go ahead and install it. And that's going to install everything that we need in order to use the Microsoft Graph. And I'll go ahead and just say OK for all the dependencies, and I accept all the licenses. Now the next step that we're going to do is I'm then going to do a search for the Microsoft Identity Client library or package. And to do this, because at the time of recording, it's still in a preview state, so I'm going to have to check the include pre-release to get this to show up. And I'll go ahead and install that as well. All right, so now we have all of our packages installed and we're in good shape. Now the next step is going to be to create the application user interface. So the first step here is it's going to really give us a workable storyboard that we can work with. So I'm going to open up the mainpage.xaml file, and I'm going to switch this to full screen XAML. So what we're going to do is we're going to replace this grid with another grid that I've already gone ahead and I've created. So I'll go ahead and then save our changes here. So what we've done here is we've created a new UI that's kind of broken into two sections. We're going to have a header section, and we're going to have a body section as well. So the header section is going to have a button to sign in. As you can see here, this is our connect button to sign in, and it's also going to be used also to sign out of our Office 365 account. And it's also got a reload button that's going to be used to list all the events in our calendar. And it's also going to have two text blocks, you see one here and one here, that are going to be used to display the application's title and the name of the currently signed in user. The body section that we're going to have, which you see down here, is going to have a couple pieces. First, it's got this little progress indicator to show when we're authenticating with Azure AD and loading events from Office 365 using the Microsoft Graph. It's also going to list have this control here, this list view control, that's going to be used to show events from my calendar. And so now we've gone through, we've created the UI for our application. And in the next demo, we're going to look at extending it for the Azure AD based authentication. In this section, now that we already have our application built and we have the experience kind of flow through already working, the next step that we're going to do is we're going to implement Azure AD authentication inside of our application. So to do that, we are going to first look at an overview of authentication. We're going to look at Azure AD, we're going to look at the app registration portal, and then we're going to look at implementing the Microsoft Authentication Library in UWP apps. Now, the Microsoft Graph leverages Azure AD like so many other applications that we have out there. And we've already gone through a lot of the different topics here that I've already talked about in the previous section. We've already done that here on this slide. The key point here is that when you build for your authentication piece, you can use multiple different options for authentication. You can either use the Azure AD v1 endpoint or the v2 endpoint. And depending on which one you're going to use, it's going to also determine which SDK you can take advantage of that's offered from Microsoft. So if you're using the v1 endpoint, you're going to use the ADAL authentication library. However, the recommendation is to use the v2 endpoint. What the v2 endpoint is going to allow us to do is to have a little bit more flexibility in terms of defining permissions for dynamic consent and a couple other options as well. So the recommendation is to use the v2 endpoint and make your life easier by using the Microsoft Authentication Library. So let's talk a little bit about what the authentication story looks like here. So we've got our application that you see up there in the top left screen here. And what I've got is my end user who's down in the left, on the left side, who's going to be using my application that's up there on the top right or top left. So what I'm going to do is that my application is first going, when I say I want to log in, the application is going to redirect the user or send the user over to Azure AD, and it's going to ask them to authenticate. And what that's going to do is that's going to trigger, like in Android, it's going to trigger the browser to navigate over to the authentication endpoint for Azure AD. Now, I'm going to go through the authentication process. I may be prompted to grant consent to the application if I haven't done this before for specific permissions and resources that it's requesting. And then once that's done, the Azure AD is going to return control back to the native application, who is going to collect the response that came back from Azure AD and use that response to then go fetch an access token. So it's going to fetch that access token from Azure AD, and that access token is then going to give me the ability to call the different resources and endpoints that I requested when I went to authenticate for that endpoint. The key point here, though, is that my native application is never going to get the credentials of the user that's using the app. Instead, Azure AD you're going to send the user to Azure AD to go log in, and Azure AD is going to give that user some sort of a token or a code, and that code is a very short life code that then can be used by the application to fetch our access token. Now, let's talk a little bit about these endpoint versions that we have that are available to us. So I already mentioned a little bit about the v1 endpoint, but let's talk more about the v2 endpoint here. The challenge with the v2 endpoint is that it does introduce some breaking changes to the protocols. And this is why it's called a v2 endpoint, because the protocol is different and requires new client library implementations. It's going to present a converged authentication process. And what that means is that we can use a single library and a single endpoint to authenticate, but we can let users log in using their consumer or Microsoft account or their Office 365 or otherwise known as work and school account. So it's kind of like a proxy over both of those different authentication endpoints. It's going to enable the same code for using the Microsoft Graph for using things like reading mail and retrieving contacts if I'm using the consumer services like OneDrive Consumer or OneDrive for Business, or Outlook.com's email and contacts offering and calendaring, or Office 365's contacts and calendar and emailing offering. I talked already a bit earlier about the dynamic consent. So what this is this is giving me the ability to not have to define the permissions up front when I register the application and force the user to then go through the entire process of accepting all the permissions and consenting to all the permissions as an all or nothing proposition. Instead, my application can request permissions at runtime from Azure AD, and if the user hasn't granted those permissions, then Azure AD will prompt the user to grant those permissions at that time. So some of the key improvements from V1 or V2 to V1 on the for the authentication endpoint. In the V1 endpoint, we had to provide a resource parameter to identify which resource that we were requesting an access token to. And unfortunately, open source libraries were not able to easily incorporate that into their requests. So now we use a scope parameter, which is supported by all libraries, to compound the resource and the permission at the same time. Now, when you build your applications with Azure AD V1, you had to register what permissions the application needed, and the user had to consent to all of those things up front, or otherwise known as statically consenting to them, as I mentioned in the last slide. But with V2, you can now send scopes that you want at the time you want them. You don't need to ask them for all the stuff up front. The changed contents of an ID token has been made in V2 to better conform to the OpenID Connect 1.0 specification, such as using the preferred username claim instead of something just called UPN, because UPN was more of a Microsoft-centric thing, and but it wasn't as much of a standard. Also in the past, if you needed a client app, a single page app, a web API, maybe a native one, you had to create multiple app registrations and wire up relationships between them, which was a bit of a challenge. But the V2 endpoint now enables one app registration for a single logical application. So it's going to allow us to create multiple platforms or add multiple platforms to a single app registration. So let's talk a little bit about the SDKs, as I mentioned earlier. As there are changes in the protocols between V1 and V2 for Azure AD, it required a change in the SDK. We have a couple different ways that we can register our applications. Azure AD gives us two different options or UI options for registering apps. The Azure AD portal is used for apps that are leveraging the V1 authentication endpoint, while the app registration portal is used for the V2 application endpoint. You're going to self-select yourself into one of these based on the endpoint that we're going to use. So for instance, because in this module, we're going to use the V2 endpoint, that means we have to use the Microsoft Authentication Library, which means we also have to use the app registration portal for creating our application. For Microsoft Graph apps, it's recommended to use the V2 endpoint, as I've said before. So you're going to use the app registration portal. You're going to first create the application, which is, think of it more as like registering the application. When I say create, I don't mean like you're going to an IDE and creating a code base just yet. You're just simply registering the application for use inside of Azure protected resources. Once I've created the application or registered the application, I'm going to obtain a copy of the app ID. That's going to be presented. And this is going to come across as a GUID. This is the unique ID for our application. I'm then going to go down to the platforms section and I'm going to add a new native application and add the necessary permissions if I want to define them up front, or at least the minimal permissions that are required. Now let's look at implementing Azure AD authentication for UWP applications. The Azure AD team provides a .NET SDK for UWP-based applications, and you're going to get this using NuGet inside of Visual Studio. So you're going to look for something called the Microsoft.identity.client, and that is the Microsoft authentication library that we can take advantage of. Now, this, at the time of the recording, is currently in preview. So you see here I've got the include pre-release checkbox enabled there or selected. And that's just to ensure that I can get the most recent version of it. So in this case, in the screenshot here, you can see I'm using a pre-release version of the library. Now in this demo, with the application created, we're now going to extend it to support authenticating with Azure AD. So this is going to be required to obtain the necessary OAuth access token to call the Microsoft Graph. In this step, you're going to integrate the MSAL library into the application. So the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and open up my app XAML file. And inside of this, I'm going to add in this following code here. And what this is going to do is define a couple brushes for me that we're going to want to use throughout the application. And it's also going to define a couple additional properties here as well. Now, I need to go through and update the client ID and the return URL to the values that I had in my native application that I created previously. So now we've gone ahead and set those values. Next thing I'm going to do is we're going to go ahead and create a new authentication helper class. So I'm going to come over here to my application and I'm going to add a new class. I'll call this class the authentication helper.cs. Now the first thing we'll do is I'm going to add a couple using statements to this. So I'm going to go ahead and add these using statements for getting references to HTTP requests, working with Windows storage, and also working with the MSAL library. I'm also going to switch this over to being a public class. And I'm going to go ahead and add in a few members here that we're going to use inside of this authentication helper. We've got one for fetching the client ID from the resources that we just pasted in a minute ago, defining our scopes for the permissions we need, using the Microsoft Graph public client application, or this is coming from the MSAL library, and then having a token, an expiration for the token, and then also grabbing our settings for the application as well. Now the first thing that we'll do is, after doing this, is we're going to go ahead and add in a new function here called the get token for user async. And what this is going to do is this is going to use the Microsoft authentication library to go get a token, silently get a token. It's going to try and fetch the access token. So this is going to prompt the user to log in if we don't have a token already. And it's then going to save their display ID, which is their email address, and their name into the settings for our application. And furthermore, we also want to have a method inside of this, inside of our authentication helper for signing out. And that's going to simply remove the user that's currently signed in and change his, set the values of the different settings we've saved. We're going to set those to null values. Now, let's go implement some code for our main application here. So in this, we first need to add a couple using statements to some things that we're going to need here. And then we're going to want to add a couple members to our main page partial class. These are going to be used to do things like check the connected state, the email address of the current user, the display name, and then also to use access the settings inside of our application. Now the first thing we're going to want to do is that inside of this application, we're going to want to define or override a method here called onNavigated_to. And what this is going to do for us is this is going to give us the ability to get access to when the view actually loads. We want to go through and get a handle to it to make a couple changes to it once it actually loads up. So we're going to go ahead and add this method, and what it's going to do is if we have a client ID, then it's going to go ahead and set up our connection button and set it to enabled. Here we just fixed up a little bit of brackets that we had messed up that I pasted it in the wrong spot, but it's all fixed up now. Okay, so we've got our on navigation piece all set up. The next piece that we're going to want to define is a method that's going to be used to trigger the authentication process. So we will add that method right before the previous one. And what this one's going to do here is that this method of signing in the current user, it's going to go attempt to get a token for the user. And if it doesn't have one locally already, then it's going to get the user to go log in with that for that token. Now the next thing we need to do is I need to wire up the event handler for our button. So if I come back over here and look at my main page, our connect button here has an event that is tied to called the connect button click. So I'm going to come back over here and we're going to implement this method. And what this method does is it'll change the visibility of the progress bar. It will then, if it's connected, it'll try and sign the current user in. Or if it's not connected, we'll try and sign the current user in. And if it is connected, then it'll go ahead and sign them out and change the visibility back to collapsed after all of that stuff happens. We want to wire up an event for our reload button that I'll just have it do nothing for right now. But now our button isn't all abandoned and everything just yet. So let's test our application. I'm going to do that by clicking on local machine. So let's go ahead and try and connect to it. So I'm going to click connect. We see our animation for the progress is working right now. And now I need to go ahead and connect. So let's go ahead and plug in my credentials. And because I haven't used this app before, I have to go through the common consent. So I'll go ahead and say accept. And sure enough, it is finding me just fine. So we've got our authentication working great inside of our application. The next step will be to implement our load events to go get data from Office 365 using the Microsoft Graph .NET SDK. So let's go ahead and disconnect and we'll log out and we'll close the app. Now that we have our application authentication set up and we're able to log in with our UWP application to Azure AD, let's now look at integrating the Microsoft Graph .NET SDK into our application. We're going to look at how the .NET SDK for the Microsoft Graph works. We're going to talk a little bit about the Graph Service Client object and then making requests. Now, developers can leverage the Microsoft Graph REST API in any kind of an application, but Microsoft also provides a native .NET SDK for the Microsoft Graph. This is going to abstract the details away from working with the REST API and dealing with all of the authentication plumbing and parsing the results. And it also is going to give us a fluent API for creating requests. So how do we integrate the Microsoft Graph for UWP applications into our app? We're going to do this using NuGet. So just like the Azure AD MSAL.NET SDK, the Microsoft Graph team provides a .NET SDK for .NET apps that works with the UWP applications. So here I've just done a search inside of Visual Studio's NuGet Manager for the Microsoft Graph, and I'm going to select it and click install to install that into my app. Now, calling the Microsoft Graph with the Graph Service Client object is very straightforward. It's just a very fluid-based application or API that we're going to work with. And so in this case here, you can see that first I'm getting an authentication client, and what that's doing is I'm creating an instance of the Azure Graph Service Client, and I'm doing that using the MSAL authentication provider called Delegate Authentication Provider. And what that's going to do is that's going to allow me to also modify the header so that I can pass in a authorization header to get access to the token, or to put the token in the header so that my request will be authenticated. All right, now we're going to go ahead and add in the Microsoft Graph. So what we're going to do first is I'm going to create a new folder inside of my app for models. And inside of this, we're going to create a new thing called a calendar event. Now I'm going to first add in a using statement. And then I'm going to go populate this by changing this to a public class and then adding in a few members to it. So I have a subject and I have a start and an end, and they've all been flagged with some data annotation stuff to customize how they're all going to work. Now let's go back to our authentication helper and let's go add in the Microsoft Graph support. So the first thing we'll do is I'll say using the Microsoft Graph, and then we're going to, let me scroll down to the bottom here and let's add in a couple things. So we're first going to add in a new private static member called the Graph Service Client, and I'll set that equal to null initially. And then I'm going to go ahead and use this method called getAuthenticateClient, and his job is going to be to create a new graph client using a delegate authentication provider, and it's going to go get the token from our existing authentication helper and then add to all the requests that happen. He's going to add in a new header value for the authorization header equal to bearer and then the access token. Now let's also go over to our sign out method where we have our sign out defined. And I'm going to just go ahead and say the authentication helper dot graph client is going to be equal to null. So I just basically want to, kill the graph client that we just created a minute ago if it's not being used. Now let's go back over to our the code behind for our XAML file, and I'm going to go add in a couple using statements. So we'll have using the native, and we also have models, because that's going to contain the object that we want to use that we created for our calendar event. And we're also going to use the Microsoft Graph as well here. Now the next thing is that we need a method here. We need to implement the function. We'll find out where it is first. Here we go, our reload button. So what happens when we click reload? We want to go through and we want to go fetch information from the Microsoft Graph. So I'm going to go ahead and add this. And what this method is going to do is called reload events. It's going to go get a reference to that authenticated graph client that we just created a minute ago in our authentication helper. We're then going to create a new request looking at me/events and just grab the top 20 events. We're then going to execute that request, and when we get the results back, we're going to walk through all of the results, and we're going to add to our counter events array that you see that we've listed up here on line 98 a bunch of new counter events based on the model object that I created a moment ago. And then we're going to check to see, did we get any counter events? And if we did, then I'm going to bind them to the event item source and make it visible. Otherwise, I'm not. I'm going to go through and just null those out so nothing shows up. So the last thing to do now is in our reload button is just to change the progress bar visibility. We'll set him, first we'll set him to the visibility of him equal to visible so that we can see it's actually working. And then we're going to do the exact same thing, but the next option we'll do is we're going to make it collapse because we don't want to see it after everything works. But the part that we're going to do in the middle is we're going to say await reload events. And it's going to go fetch all of those events for us. Now let's take a look and see if this works. So I'll go ahead and click on local machine to get it to spin up the application again. And we will first go to log into the application. So I'll go ahead and click connect. That should fire up the animation for the progress bar. It's going to have us log in. So I'll plug in my email again and my password. And so we can see we're logged in. And so now we'll just click on load events and see if we fetch data from the Microsoft Graph. And sure enough, we do. And so now you should see in your application that we're pulling back events from our Office 365 calendar using the Microsoft Graph. And so that brings us to the end of this module. We saw how to create a UWP application, add the MSAL authentication library for the V2 endpoint for Azure AD to authenticate, obtaining an access token, and then how to ultimately call the Microsoft Graph. So a couple things just to point out here too about this screencast. The slides or the demos from these screencasts, we were showing a pre-built sample for the interest of time. But if you would like to build one of these applications and see the entire process all the way through, this screencast is part of a bigger training module. And that module also includes a hands-on lab. Each of the exercises in the lab maps to one of the different demos that you saw, and it will walk you through step by step creating the same resulting solution that we used in these demos. So if you want to give this a shot for yourself, head over to the lab and check out the different exercises that are available to you. So with that, that concludes this module. I hope you learned something about creating UWP native applications using the Microsoft Graph and the Microsoft Authentication Library.